Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Almost Dropouts podcast. My name is Daivik, and today I have Jeremy with me. Jeremy, you want to introduce yourself?
Oh, hello. Yeah, my name's Jeremy, and I am just finished my Ph.D. at University of Waterloo, and I'm currently doing a startup called Mtion Interactive in the kind of metaverse adjacent space, you could say.
Perfect. Yeah, and just to add a little bit more uh, to that, so Jeremy is a doctor of philosophy in computer science and human-computer interaction, like you mentioned, at the University of Waterloo. He was previously a research intern at both Adobe and Microsoft, and yeah, he's working on his new startup, Mtion Interactive, and I thought it'd be really interesting to have him on the podcast to talk about it. But starting off, Jeremy, let's just talk about your story first. So, where does the story begin? What do you think is a good starting point for us to start with?
Yeah, this is a good question. Yeah, I guess like my journey really began, I would say, kind of back in my undergrad.
Mm-hmm.
So back a ways away, like 8 years ago, I guess now. But yeah, that's kind of where it all originated from. Like, to this point today where I'm at.
So in your undergrad, I know like now you're into human computer interaction and you did your philosophy. So is there anything like that stood out to you in your undergrad or any pivotal moments you saw that sort of drove you towards that path?
Yeah, so my path was very non-linear, I would
Mm-hmm.
say. In that, like when I initially started, so I did my undergrad at Simon Fraser University
Mm-hmm.
in Vancouver, and I initially went there for not for computer science or like engineering or like business or anything like that. I went there for fine arts,
Okay.
and I was doing music composition in my undergrad. And then that like the music composition program is kind of centered around creating like sheet music, so writing music for like ensemble. But that kind of led me to look at like electroacoustic music, which
Right.
is like using tools to generate synthesizer and things like that, which then led me into looking at computer music, which then led me to explore like a lot of kind of computer music adjacent things using this software programming language called Max MSP.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you're not familiar with Max MSP, Max MSP is a visual programming language that allows you to create like little kind of electronic instruments, I would say. And so, but yeah, so that was like my original thing, and that kind of got me into computer science, and it kind of got me. Then I switched halfway through my undergrad into computer science,
Right.
and then went into my PhD afterwards. After that.
Oh wow, that's that's a really interest. That's the first time I've ever heard a story like that. So that's really interesting how you took that fine arts, learnings and specific electronic acoustics and implemented that in computer science, and that's sort of where your passion began there. That's really interesting.
Yeah, yeah, no, it was I find like having that experience with fine arts definitely helped
Hmm.
in different ways down the road. Especially because when I started my PhD at the University of Waterloo, like I honestly didn't actually know that I wanted to do a PhD at the end of
Right.
my undergrad. Um, and like I kind of felt like I fell into it, uh, honestly. Um, but because like after I was finishing up my undergrad at Simon Fraser University, I took a course on computer vision,
Hmm.
and this was like a fourth year level course. It was more kind of research adjacent. The like at least the level kind of materials and the approach to it was more about like reading papers and trying to kind of get familiar with the current CV research. But that kind of like was my first look at research like in computer
Right.
science specifically, right? So like what is what do researchers do, right? Like like in undergrad you have your profs, right? You go to a class and you have like your prof that teaches in the front, and that's kind of your interface to him or her and the
Right.
world that they kind of that they teach, right? And but there's so much that goes on behind the scenes that I don't think a lot of undergrads realize that like your prof is actually like doing research usually, if they're like a any type of tenure or associate professor,
Hmm.
and there's just so much like interesting stuff that's occurring that a lot of undergrads don't necessarily get exposed to. And so when I took that course, like I kind of got a look into that world that kind of happens like outside of kind of the scope of undergrad,
Hmm.
and then that kind of like inspired me to apply to a few universities for PhD
Oh wow.
initially. Yeah.
Okay. No, that's super interesting. And then so you decided, okay, I want to go into research. You went to go do your PhD. What got you interested in human computer interaction specifically?
Yeah. So I mean, honestly, I didn't know what human computer interaction was before I started my PhD.
Hmm.
And I think one of the reasons was because like at like my undergrad, I didn't actually take like any HCI courses per se. But I think one thing that I was interested in, this kind of tied back to like my fine arts, was kind of the philosophy around human computer interaction, kind
Right.
of like the questions on like what is that interface between like the person using the computing system and the computing system computing, right? Like
Hmm.
how does that like function, like in both like the how the human views the computing system and how the machine interprets the inputs, right?
Right.
But yeah, no, when I applied to universities, I initially wanted to go into computer vision just because that's the undergrad course that I took up, kind of inspired me to apply.
Hmm.
But my advisor at University of Waterloo, Daniel Vogel, and some people at University of Waterloo might have taken courses with him, but he saw my application, and because like I had this like fine arts slash computer science background, it
Right.
was like very similar to like his background as well, because my advisor also had a fine arts and like computer science background. But he reached out to me, and then that kind of like blossomed into like my PhD career over the past
Hmm.
5 years.
Yeah, it's a lot of digest there. I think the first off, like it's interesting that both of you guys had that background. That's a that's a crazy connection because it's not a very conventional path at all. And I think a lot of people what they forget, sort of a little bit on a tangent here, is that
Mm.
you know all this is connected at the end of the day. Even in
Hmm.
the fine arts or computer science, a lot of people think it's very separated, which of course there's a lot of different facets there are, but at the end of there's a lot of connection in between both of them. And there's a lot of things that apply in both of them. So it's really
Hmm.
interesting to see how both you and the prof leverage your experience like that to find different connections with each other and find different areas of interest.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's the interesting thing. I think, like, especially like maybe in HCI research, but then also I think generally there's just so much, like, at the intersection of disciplines, there's just so much interesting things that can occur, right?
Hmm.
Because like you can go and be go really deep into one particular area of research, and really study that, and produce really amazing work and content. But there is also this really interesting things that emerge when you have these like intersections between like like fine arts, or like computer science, or like filmography and like computer science, or like art and different things, right? So combining things together, I find like really generates some interesting ideas, and also just like interesting novel work that you can potentially like look at and go into.
Right, right. So, okay, great. So you started your PhD. You found the professor, David Vogel, and
Daniel
oh, sorry,
Vogel.
Daniel Vogel. My
Yeah.
apologies.
No worries.
And then I saw that you had research positions at Adobe and Microsoft. So, what sort of led to those positions, and what was your goal from those positions as well?
Yeah, so I guess like in like my PhD, so like one of the common things to do is to do internships,
Hmm.
especially like in HCI. But so like what part of the research that I was looking at was looking at like spatial augmented reality,
Hmm.
which is a bit different than like augmented reality, in that in spatial augmented reality, also called SAR, it's it's using projectors, projected light, and then doing projection mapping onto like surface geometry
Okay.
to augment surfaces. Uh, so the tools that I was using for that was there was some similar things happening at Microsoft Research,
Hmm.
that was also like looking into like this concept of spatial augmented reality as well. And so and that kind of led me to like using some of the tools that my then to be mentor Andy Wilson at Microsoft that was used that built, and so I was using those, and that kind of got connected with him, and then kind of through the help of my advisor, was able to land an internship at Microsoft Research to explore like kind of the VR AR space a bit.
Right. Right. Okay. Super interesting. And then from there, like, you got those research internships, you started your
Mm.
PhD. What got you into entrepreneurship? What led you to create your startup?
Yeah, it was a hard decision, or not a hard decision, but it wasn't a straightforward path. So, I
Hmm.
mean, like when you do PhD research or like you go into a PhD program, typically there's kind of three paths or two paths that are typically people take, right? And that's either you go into, you graduate, maybe do a postdoc, and then you go into academia, right? You get like a tenure track position somewhere at some university,
Hmm.
or the other option going into a PhD is that then you go into like industrial research, right? So you get like a job at like Microsoft or Nvidia or Adobe Research, and you do research there and produce papers and all that.
Hmm.
Um, but I guess like the third option, which is taken probably less by people in going through PhD programs, is entrepreneurship.
Right.
And I think, I mean, really, I think the reason I really wanted to go into this is just because I felt that there's like so much interesting stuff happening in, the space of like kind of the intersection of like VR, like interaction, virtual spaces,
Hmm.
and there's just so much happening right now that I really wanted to see what I could do like in that space. Like so it's like what value can I bring to people? And that kind of, yeah, that kind of led me into like really thinking and then going deep into like into the startup territory and starting Motion Interactive.
Hmm. Perfect. So let's talk a little bit about motion now. So you mentioned that you were in spatial augmented reality. You're sort of already in that space, but I know motion is based in the metaverse and 3D digital spaces. So first off, what got you interested in the metaverse or 3D digital spaces?
Yeah.
And then let's talk about motion specifically with the product.
Yeah, for sure. um yeah, so maybe we can even unpack what the metaverse is
Hmm.
first,
Sure.
because I think so I mean the term the metaverse, it originated back in the 1990s, right? And so there was Neil Stevenson was an author, and it still is an author. He's amazing, does amazing science fiction writing. But back in 1991 or two, he released a book called Snow Crash, if you're familiar with it. But kind of in this book, he kind of coined the term the metaverse to describe the environment in which like the settings of the book took place in. And
Hmm.
so if you're not familiar with Stone Crash, basically the synopsis is that there's this protagonist. His name is like Hero. Actually, his name is Hero Protagonist. That's the his actual name in the book.
All
But
right.
Neil Stevenson plays around with these like names. But anyway, so the protagonist is kind of lives in this like kind of dystopian kind of commercialized world, but there's a space in which like people interact with that Neil Stevenson called the metaverse, which is like this space, virtual space that people can kind of transport to and like interact with, and there's like this whole economy and system kind of in place around that.
Hmm.
um but yeah, so that's kind of like the origin of the metaverse. But I think like over time, especially now, like in 2022, the metaverse has become like an amalgamation of a bunch of different things is kind of how I look at it.
Right.
So it's kind of like a intersection of both like AR VR is an aspect of it, virtual spaces kind of presence is an aspect of it, just general like video games is an aspect of it, and then also like this notion of like Web3 tech and NFT stuff is also kind of aspect of it as well. But
Hmm.
I think it's like a really this conflation of all of these things that actually that describe what the metaverse is. If that makes sense.
Right. No, that makes sense. Yeah, I think yeah, it's always weird whenever we talk about the metaverse. It's hard to sort of quantify what we're talking about, and I think you've illustrated pretty well where it's an amalgamation of all these different tools and technologies
Hmm.
trying to come together to make this new experience, right?
Yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah,
And I think
absolutely.
it also also part of it. A lot of people think about from Facebook's perspective, but it's not just Facebook. It's the overall. It's like a whole different experience. Not owned by Facebook, but it's owned by many people. Um,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like this conceptual idea, right, that people are kind of holding on to and they want to see happen, right? Like
mhm,
in a very real way. Yeah.
And so yeah, let's talk about the product itself. So you decided to create Mtion Interactive, which is
Hmm.
your startup, and let's talk about the company, the product. What is the company trying to achieve, and then what is your first product that you're working on?
Yeah, so Mtion Interactive is really around looking at video game live streaming space. This is
Hmm.
really like what we're passionate about, and it's really about connecting video game live streamers and their viewers together in like these shared virtual environments. And so the way that we're thinking about it is that like the live streamer as a performer, and we're giving them access to these virtual environments that we call like clubhouses,
Okay.
and these clubhouses are like these spaces that they can kind of design and build for themselves, like so they can customize it around their brand and identity. And we give them the ability to stream from those virtual spaces. So like streaming them to like Twitch, YouTube, like different live streaming platforms as like this like virtual kind of production studio type idea.
Hmm.
And but then also giving the ability to their viewers to kind of hop into these spaces so that they can like open up a link on the live stream, and then they can kind of be in these spaces with the streamer as they kind of perform and live stream to their audience.
Hmm. So and just to contextualize this for me, like I've seen some version of this, I guess. Like I know in Fortnite, Travis Scott came into the concert, and there's been some other like interactions, but this is sort of the next step in that, where streamers and a lot of web personalities can create the space, so they can do their work while which is streaming and whatever uploading to YouTube, whatever they're doing. But it's also a space for their content consumers to come in and sort of be in this virtual space that
Hmm.
around them. Is that correct? Or
Yeah, yeah. I think that that's kind of like getting to what we're doing. Yeah, but it's really about the performance like that we're trying to get at. So like really thinking about. I mean, if you look at video game live streaming today, right? Like on
Mhm.
Twitch and or YouTube, the format and kind of the engagement with their viewers hasn't really changed that much over the past 10 years as far as like the tools for interaction. And so yeah, what we're really trying to do is try to create these like those like that Fortnite experience that you mentioned, right? Like so
Right.
how can we allow like anyone to kind of be able to have that level of like immersion and entertainment like through these like virtual spaces without necessarily having to, you know, be Travis Scott, right? Or like, just like how can we give these tools to someone, anyone that wants to like live stream, um, the ability to produce engaging and entertainment content.
Right. Right. And so what can these creators like, and I don't know how much you can discuss here because I'm sure you're you're still fleshing it out, but how much can these creators like alter the space around them? What is some functionality they can do in these spaces?
Yeah, so we really think about this along, yeah, I guess for two lines. So like for the streamer, like the creator,
Mhm.
they have access to tools that we kind of think of as like a spatialized version of OBS, which is and OBS is like open broadcasting software, but it's like a tools that a lot of streamers use currently today.
Right.
But we kind of think of our like what we're building is like an enhanced version of that that's like spatialized, that contains like a bunch of new tools that's kind of built into it, that allows them to design their space and also stream from that space, and then also gives them tools to like interact with their audience through this software.
Right.
But that's kind of like the tool that they're using to interface with these virtual environments.
Right. Right. Okay, that makes sense. Um, okay, and do you know anybody else who's doing something like this, or do you guys think you're the first one in in this type of space?
Yeah, so I mean, there are like in the exploration of just, spaces, there's a lot of startups that are like exploring different things around what you could call the metaverse,
Hmm.
right? So, if you're familiar with like Decentraland or like CryptoVoxel or like Webiverse or um, like these platforms, because these platforms I would like just kind of describe as like Second Life version 2.0.
Right.
If you're familiar with what Second Life was back in like was it like the 2000s, like 2010s, but but basically they provide like these virtual environments, spaces like cities, I would probably maybe call them more so, and the whole thing around them is about like how can we tie these into like NFTs, right? How can we tie this into like blockchain technology, NFTs, like what's the commerce around the buying and selling of virtual land,
Hmm.
and stuff like that, right? And so there's a whole set of these that are kind of built around that. And then on the other side, I would say, so like if we think this is more consumer oriented economy, on more the business side, so like productivity side of things, you have a lot of startups so like looking at like event space building, um, type stuff, or like
Right.
kind of like looking at Mozilla. It's like kind of Mozilla Hubs type esque stuff, right?
Hmm.
So Mozilla Hubs is like a famous like open source software, that's it's been around for 3 years, give or take, I think now. But provides like spaces from which people can kind of like engage in conversation, and provides these like social tools to like for people to interact with, right? And so there's a whole set of kind of things around that, and then there's a whole set of things around like conference type building stuff. But
Right.
but the way that I see us is really looking at um, like really focusing on that performance aspect, and really looking at the tools to provide like that yeah, just like the tools to streamers to help them enhance their performance, like well when they do a live stream. So
Right.
and it's really we're trying to focus in on that particular niche, I guess you could say, in like kind of the video game streaming space.
Right. No, that sounds super interesting. I'm really excited to see where you guys end up, where the product ends up going, and where the company ends up going. And I think this is a pretty good segue, actually. Like you mentioned the other companies in the space,
Mm.
and you briefly mentioned NFTs and Web3 there. So I was just wondering, in general, have you guys thought about how your product interacts with the overall metaverse, or is it more of a siloed space? Have you guys thought about it from that perspective?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So yeah, and when you say like yeah, I guess the overall you meant like the kind of the interoperability thing around like the kind of the promise of the metaverse is this like interoperability
Right. Yeah.
aspect to it, right?
Hmm.
um yeah, absolutely. I think maybe even just like unpacking that a little bit too is yeah, because like right now there is there's a lot of promise, but there's also a lot of work that needs to be put into like that promise of the metaverse. I think even I don't think it's going to be any one single company that's going to be able to like, not even I don't think like Facebook or Microsoft that's going to be able to like really dictate how that's going to function,
Right.
because it's really going to have to be a collaboration between a lot of different like institutions to really create that promise of what the metaverse can be.
Hmm.
Because I guess just coming to that interoperability problem is that like one of the things, and this is kind of like what I see here, is like one of the things that blockchain, and NFT provide is they kind of solve the interoperability of transactions, right?
Right.
And I think that's an important distinction between like the interoperability of transactions and the interoperability of like assets, because those are two distinct problems in my mind, at least. But the like solving the interoperability of transactions though is really a big step, towards like having like if you purchase like a piece of land in Decentraland, right? Or you purchase like a piece of NFT art, right? So that that gets written into the blockchain, whatever blockchain that was sold on, like Ethereum. But then it's like it's publicly like accessible, like the ledger's there, and then you can know like kind of see that process of transactions and like where like all this stuff kind of links to and how this all this forms together. Um, uh, and the promise with that is that because we can this is all publicly accessible on these like blockchains, like these ledgers, that other platforms, right, can like kind of read into this blockchain and then extract
Mhm.
that data for their own platform, and so you can transfer or like have so one person that's using Decentraland might be able to go to CryptoVoxel and access their digital avatar or something, right?
Right. Yeah.
But I think the issue though with so that's great for like the transaction part. So like looking at it's like you can verify that this person owns this digital asset,
Yeah.
which is great. But the issue I think we're facing now is that interoperability of assets, and that's a harder problem, just because like there's so much like variety in how digital assets are encoded.
Yeah.
And an example of this is, I mean, if you look at, I mean, images are an interesting example because like they kind of went through this, back in like the early '90s and things like that. Interoperability between different image formats was a thing that was like being solved, right? Like you
Mhm.
have like different for like if you have JPEG formats, you have PNG, PNG, you have like TIFF, you have yeah a bunch of other different ones, but like like in a simple case like that, like an encoding of an image just describes like the pixel information,
Yeah.
right? And so then over time, companies produce these standards, and then Microsoft adopts like something that Apple produces. Apple adopts the stuff that Microsoft produces, and then you have this like interoperability. And now we have you can basically open up any image. Like it's a non-problem now, right?
Yeah.
Like reading images and looking at them. But I think like kind of like how that was in like the late '80s and '90s, like how that was kind of being worked out. We're kind of going through that same thing now, except for like digital assets, or like 3D assets,
Hmm.
and which is not fully solved yet. I would say just like encoding, avatar information, or like inverse kinematic information, like how does the
Right.
avatar move, like the texturing, like the actual textures in the avatar, like the geometry, the vertex information, all that encoding.
Right.
And so right now, I mean, there are organizations that are trying to look into ways to solve that, and then one of them is this organization called the Cronus Group, which is looking at, and Cronus Group is famous because they kind of put out OpenGL, right? So they're kind of the ones behind that.
Right.
But they're also looking at like GLTF, which is like a format for encoding kind of geometric and digital asset information, but it's still not quite there yet to have like this promise of complete interoperability of digital assets, at least right
Right.
now. Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. Like I think if you look at standardized files formats like JPEGs, like you mentioned, over 3D
Mm.
objects with USDZ or OBJ, like you get information on the asset itself, but like for this interoperability aspect, you need to have a file format that gives you more context to the asset, so you can load it into all these different spaces or different digital experiences. And I think that's
Hmm.
probably, yeah, like you mentioned, that's, I guess that's, I never thought about that problem, but that's a huge problem there
It
because
is.
it's not as it's not as like simple as getting a standardized way to classify your object. You also have to have that context in there in the file format as well.
Yeah, yeah, it's a hard problem, and that's why I think like now like NFTs are all image based, and I think there's a reason why that's the case is because images are easy, right? Like the interoperability between images is like a non-problem. But
Right.
um, but yeah, once you get into more complex file formats, it becomes more and more difficult.
Right.
Yeah, down the road.
Right. And
Yeah.
I think this is a good like transition into sort of the last question I have on Motion Interactive, which was, you know, so I know you mentioned sort of a virtual reality space for streamers, and I was just wondering, like, where do you think the balance is between a virtual reality space and your physical space that you inhibit right now? Because that's definitely a big question right now for a lot of people.
Okay, yeah, yeah, that's a good question. So you're saying like what the boundary is between the virtual and the physical?
Yeah, like where what do you think that boundary is, or what do you think it should be, or what are your thoughts on that? I guess.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Yeah, actually, because like actually my whole PhD thesis was kind of like around this question was like
Okay.
the transition between like the physical and the real.
Hmm.
Um, and so yeah, so I think the I mean the boundary between the virtual and the real, I think there's different levels in which you can think about this, right? From like a kind of a future looking forward view, like if you think from like a very mechanical aspect, right? So like what is virtual reality doing today, right? Or like these immersive worlds, and basically what it's doing, it's like co-opting sensory input, right? So if you put on a virtual reality headset, and it is basically occluding your visual optic sensing with a digital light that's produced like on a some OLED screen that's like a few inches from your eyes,
Hmm.
and it's simulating that experience that we have in the real life, stereoscopic views and things like that. um, but in that sense though, like if you think about what is meaningful like for an experience, and I think I would argue that, that a virtual experience can be as meaningful as an experience in real life.
Hmm.
And that's my view on kind of the thing and kind of where it can head. And I think if you think that, a virtual experience can be just as meaningful, right? In a sense that the experiences that you have in a virtual space, are as like important or as like impactful to you as a person as a physical experience, then I think that the boundary between the physical and the virtual is more of like a spectrum of sensation versus like a direct barrier, I think,
Right.
between the two. And that's kind of like how I see things, and some of this like comes from like some philosophy. If you're familiar with like David Chalmers, he's a philosopher from the University of in Australia,
Hmm.
but but he wrote a bit about this, right? About like virtual experiences, and like in his like essay that he writes. But basically his argument that is that the virtual reality experiences can be just as meaningful as
Right.
like physical reality experiences. And really the thing that I really see for myself is that like we need to build better tools that connect these two things,
Right.
right, together, versus like thinking about one or the other. And I think looking at tools to kind of bridge the gaps between the physical and virtual are needed and important. And that's kind of how I think about motion, because it's really trying to bridge the gap between like live streamers that aren't necessarily in a virtual world, in the sense that they are like playing video games on their desktop and like trying to engage with an audience, and with their like the viewers that are in a virtual world, and really
Right.
trying to think about how that bridge can occur, and like how yeah, that kind of information flow between everyone can happen.
Right. No, I think that makes sense, and I think the argument that it can be as meaningful. I think that's definitely very valid. I just think the next step to get that will probably have to be getting more immersive tools to do that. So, for example, what you guys are doing in motion, or even the
Mm,
tech itself. I think uh, moving the tech forward is how we get to that point. Because right now, I think the hardest, or the reason why that's not necessarily true for me, at least right now, is because of that immersion factor. Because
hmm
I can sense that, okay, this is like, for me, the real world just has so much more offer right now than the virtual world because of that immersion factor. Because the real world is more clear, and I get that sensory input from the real world that you don't necessarily get virtual. So, I think that's definitely going to be a key factor in that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think like the technology is super important, right? Like you're saying, like the immersion, because it's really about like how I mean, there are certain things, and I do want to maybe just go back on that. There are certain things in physical reality, right, that are hard to replicate.
Hmm.
Even like say 20 years from now, like virtual reality technology becomes like so good that like it's almost like indistinguishable from reality in a sense. But there's still like potential, like there's still interesting things that I think are not necessarily you're able to replicate. And
Right.
I think like one of the interesting things about physical world, just from like an immersive standpoint, is that there is like a sense of commitment and urgency that occurs. Like, so say like you attend like a meeting, right? So you can attend a meeting through Zoom, which is great. I mean, it's convenient, right? But if you go to attend a meeting in person, right? There's this commitment level that you need to engage with when you're like physically co-located with a group of people in like a room, because there's
Right.
like less, you can't escape that, right? Like, so I mean, you can like physically walk out the door, but it's not the same as like turning off your camera, right?
Right. Hmm.
And there's things like that that aren't quite like we probably won't be able to like replicate that in any type of virtual environment for like a long time. But I think as we kind of get towards that over time, like the immersion becomes more and more, like that gap between the two is going to minimize
Right.
over time. Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a sense distinct aspects in the world you can't necessarily replicate in code, or you probably can, but it's I can at least I think that's very far off where you can completely replicate in code or in that virtual world. So that makes a lot of sense.
Hmm.
And I think yeah, let's transition a little bit to the overall metaverse. Like for you, what excites you the most about the metaverse, the 3D digital space, all of that, and what do you think the like I want to I this is sort of a very general question and sort of it's a tough one to answer, but what do you see the ultimate goal of it being in a general sense?
Yeah. So I think it really, I mean, it comes down to some of the stuff I think we touched on throughout the podcast.
Hmm.
But yeah, really, I think what excites me about the metaverse is really this like I mean, it's really about giving people access to experiences that they might not have be able to access, right? And it's really about connecting people together. And I mean, one of the goals even for like motion is really about creating these like meaningful and also kind of like unexpected serendipitous moments that you kind of share with people. um, and I mean, like one of the things that's really great about live entertainment, and the reason people I think tend to like to watch live entertainment is because there there's the chance of some spontaneous thing occurring that no one expects, right?
Right.
And what's so exciting, I think, that people get from that is that when this thing occurs, is that there's a sense of shared engagement with that, like because you're now experiencing this with many other people from around the world, right?
Hmm.
In this like shared collective experience of this like thing that occurred, that happened, that no one else has experienced prior to this moment in time.
Right.
And I really think that like the metaverse is going to be like that, except way more like scalable and expansive. It's connecting people together from around the world in these like shared virtual experiences that people are be able to gauge with, that aren't scripted, that are that people, yeah, can social entertainment, all this stuff kind of in under one vision
Right.
for this virtual space. But yeah, so I think that that's what really excites me about it. And I really think that's really the goal of the metaverse as well, is really about just connecting people and creating these like meaningful experiences that would otherwise not be accessible from
Right.
different people across the world.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, like it's like you mentioned with live sports, like that experience of that feeling of experiencing something novel with
Mm,
a group of people. I think a great feeling, of course, and I think that's really
Hmm.
interesting. I never really thought about that in the context of the metaverse, but I totally see where you're coming from, and it is something completely novel. There'll be new experiences that can be created in the metaverse that haven't been done before,
Hmm.
and the possibilities are really endless. So it's gonna be interesting to see.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's exciting
Um,
times.
but yeah, I think just to wrap it up, last question I have for you before I let you go,
Mm.
and we sort of touched on this earlier in the podcast, but especially given your background in HCI, with the oncoming adoption of AR and VR on a mass scale, and of course, a lot of people have adopted already, but I think it's gonna grow exponentially now in the next couple of years. What are
Hmm.
some major challenges you see as people start adopting these technologies?
Yeah. So, that's a good question. Yeah, because the technology man, it's booming now. Like,
Yeah.
I was just looking at some like stats on like AR VR adoption, and it's like the projection over the next 5 years is insane. It's like 80 million units or something
Hmm.
crazy like that. Like actually this year, the number of Quests being sold has exceeded Xboxes being sold,
Oh, really?
which is
Wow.
yeah, by like it was just barely. It was like by a few 100,000, but yeah, it exceeded the number of Xboxes, which is pretty wild. To
Yeah.
think about it. Um, but yeah, I think like really the challenge is, I, man, I think even probably breaking that down would be like there's mechanical challenges, and I think there's like interaction challenges.
Hmm.
And I think like on the mechanical side of things, I mean, there's just issues of getting things down smaller, right? Or like getting like you said, the fidelity increasing, like getting the actual hardware lighter, getting the hardware smaller, trying to fit more like the optics better, like the field of view, increasing the field of view of headsets. So all of those I think are challenges and barriers for people kind of to get into it, just because people maybe expect some level of experience that they're not quite getting yet.
Right.
Um, so that's kind of on the hardware side of things. I think on like the actual interaction side of things, I think it really comes down to like, yeah, actually I think it really comes down to like that, like we talked about, kind of that bridge between the physical and the real world. And I think that in VR and AR, it's really about that as well. It's like, how can we allow people to kind of be in these virtual spaces, but then also how can we allow them to simultaneously engage with the physical space around them,
Right.
right? And that was actually something that I explored a bit in like my internship at Microsoft, was like looking at ways to bridge the gap between these two things,
Hmm.
through like just recreation of like the physical world, and like in compositing inside of the virtual environment. But even now you're starting to see that on a hardware and like kind of industry level, where you're seeing like talk about like mixed reality, like pass through, right? So
Hmm.
like on the Quest you have like this there's a kind of rudimentary pass through where you can kind of see this like grayscale image of the world. But um but uh, but I think like that's going to have to increase down the line, and that interoperability, or like that transition between the physical and the real, and that interaction, that kind of the porousness between those two things, going to have
Right.
to be figured out a bit more.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to see. Like, I think there's a lot of different offerings coming out for that. Like, there's that rumored Apple glasses. I know Facebook just did their own collaboration with Ray-Ban for smart
Hmm.
glasses. So I think AR technologies are definitely already moving towards that realm. And VR, of course, its own little space. But yeah, finding that interaction between both of the virtual and the physical is really interesting. And actually,
Yeah.
specifically for Microsoft, thinking about it, I remember on stage a couple of years ago, I think at E3, they showed, or maybe not E3, but somewhere they showed HoloLens and how they had like the Minecraft world on the table
Oh
and they were
yeah, I think I
interacting
remember
with
seeing
it.
that. Yeah.
And yeah, it's just I think it's a cool example to see that, right? It's you're still in
Hmm.
the physical world, but you have that virtual element in it, and I think
Hmm.
that sort of goes along the lines of what you were saying there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, it's all about that, just trying to find that balance between the physical and the real, or the physical and the virtual, and bridging these things together in good ways.
Hmm. But yeah, I think, with that said, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Last question I have, I lied
Hmm.
about that last one being the last question, but the last
No
question
worries.
I have is, what are the next steps for you at Motion Interactive?
Yeah, so yeah, like because I just finished my PhD like a month ago. But yeah, so I'm like going full in now into motion. So the plan is to do this full time. Like we're doing a like a angel pre-seed round right now. So we're raising some money from VCs, been talking with a bunch of different VC firms from all over the world, and yeah, currently yeah, going full force. And hey, we do what we might be looking to hire some people down the road too, or like internships. So if you want to reach out, you can reach out to me.
Perfect. Yeah, and I'll leave all your links below for Motion, for
Mm.
Jeremy, as personal. So if anybody wants to reach out to him, please feel free to do so. But once again, thank you so much, Jeremy, for coming on the podcast. I really enjoyed hosting you here, and I hope we can have you back on a future episode.
Yeah, absolutely. It was great talking with you as well, and definitely happy to jump on to another call whenever you want.
For sure. All right. Well, take care, everyone, and see you on the next one.